Okay, welcome to the Governance and Policy Committee meeting of Thursday, February the 24th. I'd like to be able to call this meeting to order. I would like to first of all start our meeting with the land acknowledgement that the Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is upon these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. I'm seeking to see if there's any declarations of interest on tonight's agenda. I'm not seeing any. We do have the agenda that was distributed. I am looking for a mover for that agenda, if I could, please. Trustee Edwards, any objections to the motion to approve the agenda? And seeing none, we will consider the agenda approved. We have the minutes of January 31st, 2022, found on pages 1 to 3. Are there any errors, omissions, or new business to be discussed out of that, out of the minutes found on pages 1 to 3? Not seeing. I am looking for a motion to approve those minutes, if I could. Trustee Lundquist. Any objections to that motion? Seeing none, we'll consider.
I think Jillian wanted to say something. Sorry, Michael.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I just was writing something in the chat to John.
Oh,
Yes. Okay. That was an answer to John's question. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll. I think we can. The minutes were passed. We're now moving on to number 6, the recommended action, which is the draft human rights policy. Before we start the process of being able to review that policy, I'm just going to take a liberty in order to be able to actually refer back to the last page of this, which is Appendix C, page 51. I thought it might be important for us in order to be able to just quickly and bear with me, because I think that certainly out of the last meeting that we had a number of concerns that were raised with regards to the policy. We were asked as a committee in order to be able to funnel some of those concerns to staff, which was done. There's a number of elements there. And I just wanted to touch base on them before we started to review the policy, because I think it's important to be able to put this first, because obviously the rewrite that has been done, and I thank staff for being able to put this together, obviously reflected some of the feedback that came through. I'm not going to read every single piece of this, because I mean, it was sent out, but I just wanted to bring our attention to that piece, that the trustee feedback has been relayed, and then it has been worked into the new draft that we have before us. So there were, as I said, there were 8 items. We're going to just ignore the spelling and grammar at this point, that we agreed that there needed to be some work done on it. But there were 7 other pieces that were there that was direct feedback. And again, we'll work through this as we work through the policy, but there were some concerns. First of all, the first was that ensuring that the policy clearly applied to all human rights code protected groups, and there's no perception of inequitable application or hierarchy of rights or types of oppression. The second, that there was simplifying some language to enhance accessibility, readability, and usability. There were some questions that were raised with regards to terminology and definitions and concepts. And again, I'm not going to read out the actions. The actions are there in order to be able to determine where that feedback was raised back into the the proposed human rights policy. There was some clarification on trustees' roles, questions about implementation with regards to that. And again, I just wanted to bring that to a specific attention because certainly implementation, timelines, resources, training, of course, is not addressed in the policy. It's typically that in policy, those things are not addressed in policy. That may be a procedure, it may be an action plan, it may be a move forward, but those things were not necessarily built into the plan itself. But there was some points that were raised there that were referenced back into procedures. And then 6, clarifying the procedures for complaints against students, parents, guardians, which was addressed in section 3.11, and referencing legislation, it was moved to the references section. So I just wanted to bring that to attention because I think it was important that feedback came through and that how it was built into the draft that we'll be looking at tonight. My thoughts for tonight on being able to work through the new draft is actually to be able to work through the marked copy, mark and track changes copy of that. I thought it might be worthwhile because there has been some significant change, I believe. And again, as I said earlier, I thank staff for being able to, there's a lot of work that's very evident that's gone in this in the last couple of weeks on being able to rework some of the pieces. And I thought, again, I'm open to ideas from the committee, but what I was thinking is that we should probably work through the track changes in order to be able to understand where some of the changes have taken place in direct relationship to that page 51 and page 52, and then be able to work through the policy. My concern is, and again, I'm open to suggestion, is that there has been some very significant change, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to be able to understand the change, the rationale for the change, and then also to be able to become comfortable with the change on a go-forward basis. So I'm certainly open to other suggestions, but that is certainly what I'm thinking about in order to be able to move this process forward tonight. So I'm open to any other suggestions, etc. Director Marsh.
Thanks, Chair Barrett. I was going to say, just to add to what you have said, it's not a suggestion in terms of process for this evening, but just to emphasize that we did have a conversation and we have not yet made changes to the procedures that would correspond to changes in the policy. So if the feedback was related more to procedure, so for example, some of the AODA and accessibility type of feedback we received, we're going to have much more explicit in procedure language, but that until we get the policy in a good place with the trustees, we didn't want to continue to do series of track changes in the procedures, which we will share to you once the policy gets to standing.
Right.
So I just wanted to add to that. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for that, Director March, because you and I had certainly spoke about that from a process standpoint, knowing that we've had a number of reiterations of the policy, that it certainly made sense to let's solidify the policy, because the procedures are obviously going to your point, are going to be a reflection of the policy. And to be fair, there's been a lot of work put in this, and it doesn't make sense to be able to continue to rewrite procedures as we change policy. So I think it's a better use of time. And certainly I agreed fully with the suggestion, Director Marsh. It made absolute sense. We can nail the policy, for example, and then make sure the procedures reflect the policy. So thank you for that reminder. Not that I'd forgotten, but it certainly I forgot. So we'll put that together. So what I'm suggesting is to be able to work through the track changes, and that would literally start at page 28. And then we can raise concerns, et cetera, as we work through this policy over the duration of the meeting. So if I don't see any real objections, to say that I'm kind of way off track, I think that's where we could start, because I think that will get us through the policy and drive us towards the being able to look at and understand this. So if we can start that, I'm just wondering, not sure if staff wants to try and help us lead through it. I mean, I can lead through the track changes, but just wondering if it might make sense for just to be able to reflect the changes, and then we'll deal with it literally almost piece by piece as we go through this. And if there's nothing changed, we'll move to the next change.
Thank you, Chair Barrett. If I think that Human Rights Advisor Mather and General Counsel Cotter would both be prepared to do that.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to them, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I'm open to whoever who wants to talk first. So go ahead. So.
Evening, trustees. Thank you, Trustee Barrett. So if we're starting sort of at the top of the revised draft, that starts on page 28. The first change was to strike out proactively, and that was in partial response to some feedback that word appeared several times in the policy. And when we talk about prevention, it inherently has proactive as part of prevention. So it was an unnecessary word that we've struck out in a number of places in the policy. The next line in 1.1, where we see a track change around meeting the mandate of the DDSB, that was also in response to trustee feedback around signaling what the mandate of the board is as one of the main rationales for developing this policy in terms of creating and fostering a culture of care, and where we're focusing on student and employee safety, well-being, mattering, and belonging. Trustee Barrett, I think you're on mute.
That's probably the best way to be, but what I'm sorry to interrupt you. What I'll do is I'll just, if there are questions, we'll deal with them as you speak. So not trying to interrupt you, but I want to make sure we address the questions as they come up, as opposed to going back, because I'd like to see some progression on moving forward. So I'm going to go to you, Trustee Lundquist.
Thank you. I actually don't have a question. I'm wondering I understand that we have copies of this, but there may be people watching who don't. Can we put it up on the screen? Is that possible? And if it's not, it's fine. I just think it might be preferable.
No, it's a good idea. I wish I had a thought of it. So it's a good idea if we could.
For sure we can. Executive Lead Sir Janik, are you able to share your screen?
Yep, there's screening. There it is. Perfect.
Yeah.
I can see it. Now I'm operating off two screens, so I'm not having a difficulty, but it depends on what other people are seeing. And you can minimize the one and shove your other screen to the side as well. But if you're working off two screens, it's working quite well. So sorry about that. Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. And you can continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So if there are no questions to the changes to 1.1, if it's okay, I'd like to address the track changes in 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 together. And these were in response to concerns raised or feedback raised around making sure that the policy equally applies to all code protected groups, and that there's no perception or real sense that there's a hierarchy of rights. And so what we did here was to define up front that when we use the term discrimination throughout the policy, that it does apply equally to all of the grounds. And then we've listed some as an example, and that it applies to racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, faithism, and classism. And that in addressing those forms of discrimination, we recognize that we have to take anti-discrimination approaches to address all of those. And so then again, wanting to make sure that there was no perception of a hierarchy of rights, naming anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, etc. approaches, actions, and initiatives to address all forms of discrimination. And then in 1.4, recognizing that this policy equally applies, we also wanted to highlight that there are, apart from the obligations under the code, which apply equally to everyone, that we do have obligations as well under the Anti-Racism Act and the AODA, but that also doesn't take away from the equal application of this policy to all code protected groups.
Questions with regards to the 1.2, 1.3, 1.4? The last time we were together, there was a concern about the hierarchy. So I see that this has been addressed. Are there any questions with regards to these sections? Nope. Okay, we'll continue. So it's good. Thank you. I know this is a little convoluted process, but I think it's really important that we go through section by section as instead of addressing it thematically, in order to be able that we can continue to be able to go through. So I really appreciate your patience on this. So.
Thank you so much. And then going to, there's some wording changes in 1.7. And if we can scroll down a little bit further, because the changes in 1.7 also relate to a number of changes that were made into sort of this front end section of the policy. Some of the changes were to address some of the feedback that some of the section was complex in nature, that there was ways to simplify some of the points that we were trying to raise here. And so I wish I could point to just one word, but it's really a restructure of this section to simplify it into a couple of main points. You'll be able to see that simplification in the clean version of the policy that's attached in the package, but wanted to show here where we've struck out some words, where we've combined some sections together to try to simplify without trying to lose some of the main points that we were trying to convey here. So it may be hard to see on screen here. It actually looks more jumbled than it might actually be, but the clean version of the policy that's in your package will hopefully show how we've reorganized this section. And in terms of content, there was nothing substantive added. It really was a reorg and some simplification of language.
Okay, and thank you for that. So what we'll do is we'll consider, because to your point, Devika, it is not necessarily altering the content, but being able to simplify a couple of pieces and rearrange it. So let's consider any changes that are made up to the beginning of section 2.0 policy objectives, because as you said, it really is kind of considered into the one piece. So I'm just looking for questions, comments, concerns about the balance of this section up to the start of 2.0 policy objectives. Any concerns from any trustees? Okay, I don't see any, Devika, so we could start next with the second section, the policy objectives, and maybe we can deal with all of 2.0.
If you don't mind,
not many changes, but we'll deal with that. So
thank you so much. And if you don't mind, if I could take you back to 1.11, that was one new piece that we added based on trustee feedback. I'm sorry, I didn't see it in the track changes earlier. So this was to address specific trustee feedback about recognizing in policy the important role that the district, the board, and the education system as a whole has in promoting human rights and supporting learning about human rights. So this was an addition in terms of content to the front end section.
okay, yes, thank you for that. I didn't want to, obviously, I'd not try to push this, but just thank you for pointing that out. So not seeing anything on that one either, Devika. So okay, but thank you.
Thank you. Scrolling through section 2.1, a couple of strikeouts just to reflect some of the changes that we referenced earlier in terms of the front end statements around what anti-discrimination covers. I think we might be able to scroll down a little bit more, please. Again, just some changes fitting with that, some of the changes at the front end to correspond throughout. If we can keep scrolling. So starting here where we see at K reference to legislation, some of the feedback we received was instead of including it in the body of the policy, to reference all of the applicable legislation at the end of the document I think it's in the references or resources section. So when we get to that section, you'll see the specific references to the different pieces of legislation, policies, and other documents that were referred to in the creation of this document, rather than having it spelled out here. So that's the strikeouts that you see here.
Right, and it was certainly to be able to your point, to simplify some of the pieces that we talked about that the last meeting that perhaps didn't necessarily need to be embedded here. So there's some simplification. Are there any questions, comments, concerns with regards to the changes that are made in section 2.0? No, I'm not seeing anything. So we'll move on to 3.0.
Thank you. So in 3.0, we just made some clarifications again around language based on feedback. And if we could just scroll a little bit further down. We had in the body of the policy later on a reference to duty bearer responsibilities and what that meant for employees. So we just did a little bit of reorg by defining what we mean by employees here and clarifying what we mean by duty bearer responsibilities later on in the document, which I'll explain when we get there. And if we're okay to move along, here we have added socioeconomic status. We've updated the language to include more inclusive language, and then scrolling further down. So this is the section that speaks to the grounds that are covered by this policy. We removed some of the pieces that were, I think, more explanatory or informational, and try again in response to feedback about simplifying some of the content and streamlining it. So again, not taking away from the substantive piece around what's included or what's covered by policy, but by removing and streamlining some of the unnecessary language there.
And if you notice in, if I can just jump in, Davica, in 3.5, at the suggestion of the trustees, we've added, sorry, it's in the new 3.5. If you keep scrolling up, we've added socioeconomic status to the bottom of that list as a new ground. And if you go up, sorry, just go back up to the preamble. So we had to change this to under the Human Rights Code because that's an additional ground. So now the prohibited grounds under our policy include all the human rights grounds plus socioeconomic status, which we've added. So that's why there's that change to the preamble as well. Just want to clarify that.
Just to build on that then, Patrick, that socioeconomic status is not something that is necessarily part of the official human rights code, but that we are expanding our pieces, like you said, of prohibited ground. So, because it's not the human rights code.
That's correct. We've expanded that's not a prohibited ground.
Yeah.
In all respects, it is, you'll see in the strikeout above it, it is a code protected ground to the extent there's receipt of public assistance in housing only.
Right.
But otherwise not. So this is now under our policy, we've expanded and we are treating socioeconomic status as if it's a ground listed in the code.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I got two hands, Trustee Edwards and Trustee Lundquist.
Sorry. I was just going to say, although it isn't part under the recent review, the report on education, the education report, but also a couple of social economic status was to be considered. So it's really good that we have it in there. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Trustee Edwards. Trustee Lundquist.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad to hear another trustee speak to this. I had raised this because I think it's really important in terms of educational equity. But I did want to say thank you for the inclusion of it and recognizing the importance of it, because one of the things I think we forget sometimes is that the Human Rights Code is the bare minimum, right? It's not something you strive to, it's what you're required to do. So supplementing it in this way, I actually think is appropriate and entirely recognizes the reality of so many of our students in the system. So I just wanted to say thank you for acknowledging that. I think it's really a really vitally important addition.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist, and I could not agree more. It's certainly been a focus for a number of years in the board as well, and I think it's as much as being able to recognize that we certainly have made this an important part of our being and our culture. You know, I think we're in the middle of an auction, or maybe it's just finished with because I know I'm not winning anything for the foundation. So I think that that's an important element. So agreed. And Darlene, I see that you joined us. So terrific. So I'll acknowledge that. Thank you. And yeah, we can continue, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think if we can scroll down a little bit further. So no changes in the policy violation section here, other than just a couple of changes to be consistent with the rest of the document. In this section here, this was in response to feedback to make it a little bit clearer in policy, the processes for different DDSB members to raise complaints. So what is the procedure that employees use? What is the procedure that students or family use? And what is the procedure when there are complaints against students or community members? So we've added these 3 pieces here to clarify that.
Questions on any of those sections? I just had a question, not a question. Well, yeah, maybe it's a question. Can you describe to me what 3.11C actually might look like, in the sense of like of an example, or are we potentially talking about like, I know we're saying students and parents or guardians, but community members is also a broad piece. So I just want to make sure that fleshing it out, that because communities is fairly broad. It could occur in many different areas and locations. Can you just kind of flesh that out for me a little bit, to what that might look like, in the sense of, I recognize we still have procedure, et cetera, to deal with, but just what that might look like, because it's a broad mandate.
Yeah, so if I can jump in, David, if that's okay. So I think the concept here is, we're dealing, primarily with, in this category C, we've already carved out employees and that sort of thing in the first one. And so really we're dealing with students and families in this one, and their obligations really, and the ability to control or sanction conduct really flows from the Code of Conduct and Discipline for Students, which governs the conduct of students and also, parents and caregivers. So, and that's typically dealt with at the school level by the principal, and if necessary by the family school superintendent, and how that's handled in terms of gaining compliance with the code, and how that's handled. So practically speaking, if, let's say, you had a parent violate the human rights policy by engaging in discriminatory conduct against another family or something, you would have the principal then, likely in consultation with the family school superintendent, send a letter to the parent saying, look, under our code of conduct, you have to behave respectfully, and you have to honor DDSB policies and procedures. You've breached the human rights policy, and therefore, we're going to implement the following, whatever that might be in terms of contact with the other family, might be when you're, attendance at the school, that sort of thing. So that's sort of what it would look like. It'd be school-based, really, driven primarily by the principal in consultation with the family of school superintendent.
Okay, and I don't want to create more complexity than this is. I'm just wondering, for example, because you had said school-based, so that probably prompted my next question, Patrick, in the sense that, the school board in normal times, and I'm talking about, pre-COVID, if we can remember those days, we would hold events, let's say at the school board, parents for partners, things of that nature. Would that fall within that scope? Because then that wouldn't necessarily be school-based, but it'd still be kind of like student school-based, I guess. So I'm just seeking for clarification. So.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair question. I think we would still do that through their home school, even if they were attending at an event at the Ed Center, for example. Obviously, we also dovetailing this with our community use of schools as well, in terms of compliance with the code, and anybody, when we're permitting property, we're also going to be ensuring compliance with the human rights policy. So that's another way we would dovetail it in. That's really not made maybe expressly clear here, but you'll recall we did incorporate that into our community use of schools policy as well.
Okay, all right, thank you for that clarification. Not seeing any other individuals, so we can continue, so thank you.
Thank you. In 3.12, it's just a couple of editing changes to be consistent with how, consistent with the flow from previous sections. At 3.13 there, where we're talking about competing rights, the addition there was based on feedback, just to recognize that, you know, we're applying some of the principles that is provided in guidance provided by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, but we also need to consider evolving case law. And so we're looking at the principles of the Commission's policy, but also relevant case law when addressing any issue, but in particular issues around competing rights.
Okay.
And if there are no questions there.
Yep. I'll definitely interrupt you if there are. So.
Thank you. This next section again has a lot of changes reflected in the track changes version, but again, some of it is some wording changes, some reorganization. The section that was around the trustee responsibilities was actually there before. We've just moved it up from another section and putting it right at the top of this section around responsibilities. And then we did make a couple of editing changes to the section based on feedback from trustees. Again, it might be harder to see here, but the clean version, the untracked changes version might be easier to read. And if we can scroll down a little bit further, we talk about employee responsibilities and our framing of those as duty bearers, and what that means in terms of employees' roles as both, or the district's role both as an employer and a service provider under the Human Rights Code and other legislation, and what our responsibilities are. So it was just really cleaning up some of the language there, and a bit of reorg again to try to simplify and to streamline. And then in 3.20, D, that was actually there before, we just moved it up to reflect some changes that you'll see a bit further down. And if we keep going, you'll see that where it was struck out before and moved up, a couple of wording changes throughout this section. And then here's where we see sort of the deletion of the section that was there before around trustee responsibilities and how it was moved up to an earlier section.
Just a question on it's your new 3.19, sorry, as duty bearers. I just want to read that again, sorry, because we're introducing the term duty bearers because we've taken it out of the title. So as duty bearers, all employees. Okay, because when I first read it, I was looking that we were introducing a new term, and again, maybe it's just me, and if other trustees don't see it, I was just wondering if we say duty bearers, if it's clear enough that duty bearers are all employees, and maybe that reads clear enough. And I'm not seeing anybody else kind of going, you know, yeah, they all see. I think they're all seeing it as quite clear. So you can move on. I think I'm the only one who was confused over it. All employees are duty bearers, correct?
Right,
Yes.
and if it helps, if we scroll up just to 3.18, there is a bit of an explanation there about what we mean by duty bearers, and then it's also defined in the.
We don't classify it the term that they're duty bearers. We explain they all have a duty, but we don't really say bracket duty bearers. So then we talk about the term in the next one. But if I'm the only one who's, you know, I definitely march the beat of a different drummer. Trustee Lundquist.
So you're not the only one. I think I've probably been fairly clear that I'm struggling with the language around duty bearers, and I'm still struggling with it, to be honest. I recognize the importance of acknowledging that people have heightened duties sometimes. You know, we don't all have the same level of responsibility and duties in the jobs we have and in the way that work is done. But I'm struggling with this because my fear has always, it's twofold. I think duty bearers has a specific meaning in law that is not reflected in this document, but I can get past that. But I still don't have this clearly formed. I just want to put it out there on the table now because I might come back to it if this goes forward. The challenge that I have really is that we all have special responsibilities in terms of human rights. Like, they are quasi-constitutional in nature, and so I don't want to agree to a document that might suggest that those responsibilities are not broadly important across the board in terms of everybody in the system, parents, students, etc. And so I understand as an employer, we have different, an employer has different responsibilities, and so does staff. I'm not entirely comfortable with the language of duty bearers though, and I have expressed that before. So I'm going to stop talking at this stage about it, but I think it might be something that I might need to revisit.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. Yeah, my concern was about how it was introduced, and yours is a broader context as well, just in the definition of and the responsibility of the definition of what a duty bearer is. Yeah, so, okay. So what I've done is I've made a note of that one, because I think that one is one area that still probably might have a question mark still in it on that section, on the defining of duty bearers. Because what I understand you're saying, Trustee Lundquist, is really three elements. There's the employer responsibility, an employee responsibility, and then a community responsibility within that. And there's different levels of, well, I don't even want to say different levels because I may be saying it wrong. So there are responsibilities within each one of those sections. I'm trying to broaden it a bit, so without getting myself into trouble. So
I acknowledge that there's some complexity to this, this section, and so I'm not trying to be difficult. As I say, I would just like some time to reflect on it. I don't want to spring a surprise later on and say, yeah, I was entirely comfortable with this language tonight, but I'm not, 3 weeks from now. So I maybe I can learn to live with it. I think I'm not there yet, and I didn't want to surprise anybody later on, frankly.
yeah, okay, thank you. Go ahead, Devika. Sorry.
Thank you. No, actually, if we can scroll back up to that duty bearer section, I just wanted to flag, in case it helps, and a little bit further up, please. Right there, 3.16. So here we've changed the section heading to responsibilities, and we've talked about everyone having a responsibility to treat each other with dignity and respect and to not violate the policy as a broad statement for everybody. And then what the roles of trustees are. And then if we can scroll down, further breaking that down into additional roles and responsibilities for staff in terms of our role as both an employer and a service provider. And then if it helps to clarify what those responsibilities are, that's what we get into in 3.19 A, B, and if we can scroll a little bit further down in terms of the roles that we play. And part of this concept is that these responsibilities then tie directly into the procedures. So when we talk about how do we promote and identify and address barriers, that's connected to one of our procedures. So it spells out what staff need to do to prevent discrimination. The piece around inclusive design and accommodation procedure is the answer to what staff have to do to respond. Learning is sort of applying across all. And then correcting human rights issues, incidents, and complaints. The procedural element of that is the student complaints process, the employee complaints process. So it was really to point out that as an employer and a service provider, we have these other pieces that we're required to do, and that we have procedures that go along to support those. And I don't know if that entirely addresses Trustee Lundquist's concern, but just wanted to explain that piece a little bit as well.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Lundquist.
I'm sorry, because I don't want to dwell on this, but when I look at E, for example, the correct and address human rights issues, incidents, and complaints, I'm trying to picture how that happens in practice, to be honest. And so I get, and this is why I find this part a little bit troubling, because I don't know how many of our staff members would be in any position to do that. Like truly. So I can appreciate if it's student on student or whatnot, but if it's staff on staff and you're not in administration, if like I'm struggling with how that works conceptually, frankly.
Go ahead, Director Marsh.
Sure. So I'll start, and then Human Rights Advisor Mather can perhaps build on what I'm saying. So there are two pieces I wanted to address here. The first one was in terms of the terminology duty bearer, and understand the feedback for sure. One of the things that we talked a lot about this term at the senior staff table, because one of the things we really wanted to emphasize in terms of human rights and Indigenous rights was that all policies and procedures direct staff in terms of responsibilities, but we actually wanted to elevate the responsibilities that they have in terms of that duty bearer. And so we've been using the language intentionally to really elevate that sense of responsibility, and to ensure that we understand that it is in relation to it's greater than the policies and procedures that the Durham District School Board has. So that was one of the reasons why we wanted to use the term, because it is that call to action language. And it was one that we often see in terms of treaties. When we think about Indigenous rights, and people think that the treaties apply to First Nations people, and we always talk about the importance of understanding we're all part of that treaty, and the duty bearer example, I think, is similar to that. In terms of the preparation for staff, I mean, that was a question that was asked of us in terms of operational, and we can provide a little bit of that background at some point, Chair Barrett, in terms of our implementation table and how we're planning to assist staff. We recognize that not all staff will necessarily have the same knowledge or understanding, but I think there's certain thresholds where they would know that they need to talk to a supervisor. And I think that's the part that we're, depending on role, the training may look differently in terms of what you do when you think you see a violation of human rights, but that there would be training for all staff. And we do have an implementation table with all the unions and associations represented there in terms of thinking about how we make sure staff are knowledgeable about the contents of the procedures and the policy. So Human Rights Advisor may have more to add, and I'm not sure if I've helped or not, Trustee Lundquist, with that commentary.
Okay, thank you, Director Marsh. Go ahead.
Sorry, thank you, Director Marsh. If we can just scroll up a tiny bit thank you so much. Trustee Lundquist, to address your concern, we've added the language, or the language was already there in terms of, addressing these duty bearer responsibilities in a way that's appropriate to somebody's role within the scope of their authority and their influence. And then the human rights roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities framework goes into each of these 5 categories of responsibilities into much more detail, and by sort of position, not every position, but positions within the organization, whether it's the role of the director, whether it's the role of managers, supervisors, people in positions of responsibility, and employees as well. So when we talk about correcting discrimination for an employee who may not have managerial oversight or supervisory oversight, what that correction could look like in the scope of their role.
Trustee Lundquist?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the last thing I'm going to say about this, I promise. So I'm glad to hear a discussion about having some of the unions or perhaps other representatives of employee groups who are ununionized at a table talking about this implementation, because here's what I'm worried about. I think some of this lacks clarity, and clarity in policy is a requirement under KVP. So if you're going to enforce a policy, it has to be clear, expectations need, all of those, there's a whole bunch of elements. And I'm worried that some of that isn't clear. and won't be. And so, you know, if there's a path forward in terms of clarity, I think that's helpful and frankly necessary, because otherwise I think we're going to end up in a bunch of litigation unnecessarily. And that is not something that I know anybody wants. And I don't mean human rights litigation, I mean litigation around a policy applying in a way that when the policy isn't clear and unequivocal and all of the rest of it. So I'm going to stop talking about this section at this stage, and I appreciate the comments that have been made and I will reflect on them, but I have some level of discomfort about it. And I think it's important that it gets expressed now, because we have one real shot at making sure the policy has the required level of clarity, that we can revisit it, but you know, for our purposes, this is our chance to make it clear and enforceable. So I thank you for those clarifications.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. I'm just going to kind of in my own mind circle this one as still a cautionary piece, as opposed to the others that we've kind of moved forward on. But I'm going to circle this one section with the comments on from both staff and trustees. So. Okay, but so we will move forward if we could. So thank you.
Thank you. So I think we've covered some of the other changes in this section already. If we can scroll down a little bit further. Yes, so then I think we're at section C in terms of the policy framework, or what we've now corrected to policy directives. So some of the changes that are here are just to try to streamline and strengthen some of the language and clarify some of the policy directives that will be implemented through procedures and practices. And then a couple of wording changes throughout, again, to be consistent with some of the initial framing. No substantive additions here. Just changes, again, some streamlining and some wording changes. At G, one of the pieces we added in terms, sorry, I guess that's a Q. Sorry about that. One of the changes that we added in was to reflect feedback from trustees as well in terms of public reporting, and making it really clear that those reports come to the Board of Trustees to report on the effectiveness of the policy. And then in some of the sections further below, so at 3.24, just some reorg there to shift some of the language to reflect the change that's made in Q. So if we can scroll down a little bit. Yeah, thank you. And then if there's no questions on those, in the communication section, just a slight wording change. And then in the evaluation section, here's where we also reflected some of trustees' feedback in terms of the review cycle. And so there was some feedback that perhaps every 5 years was too long. So wanted to clarify that it would be reviewed as it's necessary to review and update, but it would be done at least every 5 years. We did talk a little bit about whether or not to reduce that cycle. One of the challenges that we just wanted to consider is that because of the broad scope of policies that we have and the policy review cycle and all of the pieces that go along with policy review, including the stakeholder consultations, data analysis and review, and the broad scope of policies that changes to this policy may in turn influence, that it might not be feasible to do it on a cycle on a more frequent cycle, but did want to add in some language to address trustees' concerns about when we might trigger an earlier review. And that includes some information, trends, or data or analysis that's included in those reports that I referenced earlier. So if we're seeing alarming trends, or if we're seeing data that shows that we might need to make some changes to the policy sooner, then that is one way to trigger the review process earlier.
It also keeps it compliant with the policy on policy review, the way that we've framed it.
And would there not, and sorry, just to, I'm recognizing that what we're trying to do is to ensure that if there is a change, you know, whether it's data driven or whatever the case may be, it's not effective, etc. And I don't want to get overcomplicated in as well. I mean, but the reality is if there's a change in the human rights code or regulation, et cetera, that's also going to trigger a review. I'm not sure that we really have to mention that there, or we could mention every element, but that might be just a given. If the ministry says, or the legislation changes, then it's going to change as well. So, but okay, I'm just going to leave that there. I don't want to try and cover every single eventuality. We'll have the universe tied up in this one. So, okay.
Thank you for that. And then this is the last section of the main policy, and it's just to reflect the changes that were made to move some of the references to legislation out of the earlier sections and list them here. I don't think there's anything else there. And then there were some changes to terminology in the glossary.
Yes, yeah.
So we'll just scroll to the first ones. So here is where we've, based on trustee feedback and recognizing the importance of addressing ableism through the policy, but also recognizing what we can say about ableism, how we can address it through policy versus procedure versus other documents that would support the implementation of this policy. Based on the feedback we did receive, we did add in reference under the definition of disability to the medical model, functional model, and social model of disability to support some of our efforts to address ableism. And then if there are no questions, if we can scroll further down, here's where we're also clarifying, again, duty bearer responsibilities. And if we can scroll further down. To address some of the concerns about some of the complexity of language, we removed the words marginalized and minoritized groups from the body of the policy, so removed it from the list of definitions as well. Where we did use those terms before, we've left in the words groups that are discriminated against to cover the groups that we're meaning without adding complexity to the language. We also added neurodiversity based on feedback in terms of, again, trying to address some of the nuances around ableism that we'll be able to more explicitly address in some of the procedures and in some of the supporting documents. A couple of just slight wording changes there. Prohibited grounds, again, to reflect the policy as opposed to the code. And to expand on the definition of trans to make it a little bit more clearer and to provide some more examples of what we meant there. And then there was just a slight correction it was an editing piece at the end there.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. In order, kind of in summary, the way that I see the feedback tonight, a couple of areas of clarification. If I was to kind of summarize the discussion, I think that the area that probably needs just a little bit of clarification and potentially touching is with regards to that element of duty bearer, and with regards to, I guess, the clarification of, and Nikki, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but so help me, is the clarification of the responsibilities in order to be able to ensure that there's clarity of the role and duties, I guess, if I could put it that respect. But what I'm seeing from the general conversation with regards here, and I'm looking for trustees, is that with that, just a little bit of reworking on that one section, that we could potentially move this forward and being able to write the next part of this, Director Marsh, as you had talked earlier about, on being able to deliver that second important part of the policy with the touching of that, I think it's 3.16 from that section. Is trustees, is that a fair assessment of our discussion tonight in order to be able to move this forward. So otherwise, the only piece that I would work on is the 3.16, just a touch. And if I could suggest, and I don't want to step outside of any boundaries or whatever. Okay, I'll stop. Trustee Lundquist.
No, I was going to say, I just wanted to say thank you. I recognize that this is a considerable change from what we saw. I actually think it's a more effective policy now. I think it's really gone in the right direction, and I appreciate how much work would go into that in very short order, relatively speaking. So I really just wanted to say I appreciate that our feedback was sought and for the most part was heeded and incorporated. So, I know that sometimes drafting policy is a thankless job, but I wanted to say thank you because it really does make a difference if we have a usable policy for people to vindicate their rights. So thank you for all of that work.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. So what I was going to suggest, Trustee Edwards.
I don't want to set the record because I do want to appreciate, because I know there was a lot of work around the anti-ableism and accessibility, and it was definitely reflected. And as you can see, I didn't have many comments, so I was quite pleased with the changes that were made in the policy.
I was taking that, Trustee Edwards, as a positive, as I was looking to you when we were addressing the issues of the ableism, and if you didn't put your hand up, I thought that was a positive piece. So that's what I was looking at. So what I'm suggesting, trustees, except for just a touching of that 3.16, in order to be able to further clarify that, and I was going to potentially suggest, that even if that draft potentially could be the tweaking, as I'm going to call it, of that could be even circulated, before our next meeting. We might be able to have an opportunity to just to clarify the language to address that. But I'm not, Director Marsh, I'm looking to you, but I don't think that the clarification of that piece would hold us up from being able to work on the next section. So if that's okay, you're nodding. So because I think that we can move forward with that except for that one piece, we've kind of drawn the circle around it, and then we can work on the second section, which could be at our next meeting, the procedural piece that you had talked about earlier, if we're on the same wavelength.
Trustee Barrett, we were thinking we would bring the procedures to standing. Because we still have the connecting policies in relation to the safe and respectful workplace and anti-harassment that's been connected to the human rights. You may recall we've shared one draft with you already.
Right.
So we are keen to get that one in front of you as well, so that these can go forward this year. They could potentially, depending on how things go, go to standing in April, and then be approved by the end of the this year.
Right. Okay. So really, just to clarify, you want to bring those that second respectful workplace policy here back to the governance committee. The procedures will not come back here because they are the purview of the operational detail. They'd be attached to the policy as it comes forward to standing, but we still have that one just respectful workplace piece that still needs to be able to be reviewed, and that would be the next section we would look at our next meeting. Correct?
Correct. And I mean, it's not, if we have the procedures ready to go, we can share them at the governance meeting. Not opposed to that at all in terms of, but I'm hoping we get to the policy piece that does need to get going too, in terms of the respectful workplace. And so if we spend too much time on the procedures at the meeting, we may lose a bit of the traction for the other policy.
Yep, fully understand. So I guess my next question then would be, Director Marsh, is that when can we expect to be able to have that draft that would be prepared so that we can plan our next meeting from the next piece? And I see Patrick has his hand up, so he might address that. So Patrick, go ahead.
It's on a separate comment. I can wait till you guys are done, close the loop on this.
Oh, I thought he was maybe going to help us there, Director Marsh, but so I'm just understanding when we look at planning the next meeting, Director Marsh, I'll look to
So
you.
with the support of the trustees, it would be wonderful if we could meet again in March. I know that March is a shorter month with the family holiday of March break, but potentially following the March break, and we could send a poll out. That way we're still tracking then potentially to get both policies forward into April standing, which I think would be great if we could, but understand that the second set of policies you haven't spent as much time on as this one. And so that may be too ambitious, but would like to aim for it if possible.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll work through Jillian to be able to establish what that potential next date would be through a doodle poll. I might suggest, Jillian, I know you're off camera. Let's start with me first, because I know that just March is an ugly month for all of us. So, and then we'll send out a doodle poll of potential dates. Okay, that works. Okay, as long as you're going like this, I'm okay. So now
It's excellent. Really appreciate that flexibility on the part of the trustees in terms of a second governance meeting in March.
Yeah, they may not agree to it, Nora, but I just kind of, so one person isn't confirmation, but we'll give it the shot. Patrick.
Right, thank you. Through you, Chair Barrett. I just wanted to come back to a concern that Trustee Lundquist raised around, enforceability of the policy and with respect to employees in terms of a grievance that they may launch relying on KPV. And certainly no dispute that KPV requires that, certain level of clarity for enforcement. But I think, we're of the view that the policy and the procedure read together would provide that necessary clarity. And it's not, the arbitrator would not, in my view anyway, and we can maybe take it offline, but I think in my view, the arbitrator would not be concerned with whether it's in a policy or a procedure. As long as the requisite clarity is there, that would be the relevant question. And so we would say that read together between the policy and the procedure, there would be the requisite clarity in terms of the duty bearer responsibility. That's all I want to add, Chair Barrett. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I was just seeing if the mute button was going to go off or not. So Patrick, so it did not. So you're saved by a mute button. So okay, so trustees, just looking at our agenda, we have accomplished what we wanted to set out on our agenda. I know it's not 8 o'clock. We can stay here for the next 56 minutes if we so desire, but I'm going to suggest that we will work on setting up that next meeting, that since we have accomplished the items on the agenda as set out in the approval of the agenda, I will declare this meeting adjourned. And I thank everybody for coming out tonight and for your input. And I thank those individuals that did take the time to be able to provide feedback back to staff. I think it helped be able to shape in order to be able to the redesign and the rewriting of the policy. So I thank that. And again, just to echo the sentiments already expressed, appreciate the work that has gone into this to be able to incorporate those concerns in order to be able to address some of the issues that we talked about at our last meeting. So thank you, trustees, and have a good rest of the evening. So.
Thank you, Trustee Barrett. Good night, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Trustee
you.
Barrett.
Good night.
Everyone.
Good night, everyone.